The French colonial empire constituted the overseas colonies, protectorates and mandate territories that came under French rule from the 17th century onward. A distinction is generally made between the first colonial empire, that existed until 1814, by which time most of it had been lost, and the second colonial empire, which began with the conquest of Algiers in 1830. The Second Empire came to an end after the loss of bitter wars in Vietnam and Algeria, and peaceful decolonization elsewhere after 1960. Competing with Spain, Portugal, the United Provinces, and later England, France began to establish colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and India in the 17th century. A series of wars with Great Britain and other European major powers during the 18th century and early 19th century resulted in France losing nearly all of its conquests. France rebuilt a new empire mostly after 1850, concentrating chiefly in Africa, as well as Indochina and the South Pacific. Republicans, at first hostile to empire, only became supportive when Germany started to build her own colonial empire. As it developed, the new empire took on roles of trade with France, especially supplying raw materials and purchasing manufactured items, as well as lending prestige to the motherland and spreading French civilization and language, and the Catholic religion. It also provided manpower in the world wars. It became a moral mission to lift the world up to French standards by bringing Christianity and French culture. In 1884, the leading exponent of colonialism, Jules Ferry, declared, "The higher races have a right over the lower races. They have a duty to civilize the inferior races." Full citizenship rights, assimilation, were offered, although in reality, assimilation was always receding, and the colonial populations treated like subjects not citizens. France sent small numbers of settlers to its empire, contrary to Great Britain, and previously Spain and Portugal, with the only notable exception of Algeria, where the French settlers nonetheless always remained a small minority. By the 1900s it was the second largest colonial empire in the world behind the British Empire, including metropolitan France. The total amount of land under French sovereignty reached nearly 13 million km², with a population of 110 million people in 1939. In World War II, Charles de Gaulle and the Free French used the overseas colonies as bases from which they fought to liberate France. Historian Tony Chafer argues, in an effort to restore its world power status after the humiliation of defeat and occupation, France was eager to maintain its overseas empire at the end of the Second World War. However, after 1945, anti-colonial movements began to challenge European authority. The French Constitution of October 27, 1946, established the French Union, which endured until 1958. Newer remnants of the colonial empire were integrated into France as overseas departments and territories within the French Union. These now total altogether 119,394 square kilometers, which amounts to only 1% of the pre-1939 French colonial empire's area, with 2.7 million people living in them in 2013. Their locations in all oceans of the world, however, give France the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world after that of the United States. By the 1970s, says Robert Aldrich, the last vestiges of empire held little interest for the French. He argues, except for the traumatic decolonization of Algeria. However, what is remarkable is how few long-lasting effects on France the giving up of empire entailed. First French colonial empire. During the 16th century, the French colonization of the Americas began. The Americas excursions of Giovanni da Verrazzano and Jacques Cartier in the early 16th century, as well as the frequent voyages of French boats and fishermen to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland throughout that century, were the precursors to the story of France's colonial expansion. But Spain's jealous protection of its foreign monopoly and the further distractions caused in France itself in the later 16th century by the French wars of religion, prevented any constant efforts by France to settle colonies. Early French attempts to found colonies in 1612 at São Luís, and in Brazil, in 1555 at Rio de Janeiro and in Florida were not successful, due to a lack of official interest and to Portuguese and Spanish vigilance. The story of France's colonial empire truly began on the 27th of July 1605, with the foundation of Port Royal in the colony of Acadia in North America, in what is now Nova Scotia, Canada. A few years later, in 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, which was to become the capital of the enormous but sparsely settled, fur-trading colony of New France. New France had a rather small population, which resulted from more emphasis being placed on the fur trade rather than agricultural settlements. Due to this emphasis, the French relied heavily on creating friendly contacts with the local First Nations community, without the appetite of New England for land, and by relying solely on Aboriginals to supply them with fur at the trading posts. The French composed a complex series of military, commercial, and diplomatic connections. These became the most enduring alliances between the French and the First Nation community. The French were, however, under pressure from religious orders to convert them to Catholicism, although, through alliances with various Native American tribes, the French were able to exert a loose control over much of the North American continent. Areas of French settlement were generally limited to the St. Lawrence River Valley. Prior to the establishment of the 1663 Sovereign Council, the territories of New France were developed as mercantile colonies. It is only after the arrival of Intendant John Tallon in 1665 that France gave its American colonies the proper means to develop population colonies, comparable to that of the British. But there was relatively little interest in colonialism in France, which concentrated rather on dominance within Europe, and for most of its history, New France was far behind the British North American colonies in both population and economic development. Acadia itself was lost to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. In 1699, French territorial claims in North America expanded still further, with the foundation of Louisiana in the basin of the Mississippi River. The extensive trading network throughout the region connected to Canada through the Great Lakes was maintained through a vast system of fortifications, many of them centered in the Illinois country and in present-day Arkansas. As the French Empire in North America grew, the French also began to build a smaller but more profitable empire in the West Indies. Settlement along the South American coast in what is today French Guiana began in 1624, and a colony was founded on St. Kitts in 1625. The Compagnie des Isles de l'Amérique founded colonies in Guadeloupe and Martinique in 1635, and a colony was later founded on St. Lucia Bay. The food-producing plantations of these colonies were built and sustained through slavery, with the supply of slaves dependent on the African slave trade. Local resistance by the indigenous peoples resulted in the Carib expulsion of 1660. France's most important Caribbean colonial possession was established in 1664, when the colony of Saint-Domingue was founded on the western half of the Spanish island of Hispaniola. In the 18th century, Saint-Domingue grew to be the richest sugar colony in the Caribbean. The eastern half of Hispaniola also came under French rule for a short period, after being given to France by Spain in 1795. Africa and Asia. French colonial expansion wasn't limited to the New World. In Senegal in West Africa, the French began to establish trading posts along the coast in 1624. In 1664, the French East India Company was established to compete for trade in the East. With the decay of the Ottoman Empire, in 1830 the French seized Algiers, thus beginning the colonization of French North Africa. During the First World War, after France had suffered heavy casualties on the Western Front, They began to recruit soldiers from their African empire. By 1917, France had recruited 270,000 African soldiers. Their most decorated regiments came from Morocco, but due to the pacification going on at the time, they were only able to recruit 23,000 Moroccans. African soldiers had success in the Battle of Verdun and failure in the offensive of Nivelle, but in general, regardless of their usefulness, French generals did not think highly of their African troops. After the First World War, France's African war aims were not being decided by her cabinet or the official mind of the colonial ministry, but rather the leaders of the colonial movement in French Africa. The first occasion of this occurring happened in 1915–1916, when François-Georges Picot met with the British to discuss the division of Cameroon. Picot proceeded with negotiations with neither the oversight of the French president nor the cabinet. What resulted was Britain giving 9/10 of Cameroon to the French, in where Picot emphasized the demands of the French colonist over the French cabinet. This policy of French colonial leaders determining France's African war aims can be seen throughout much of France's empire. Colonies were established in India, in Chandernagore and Pondicherry in the southeast, and later at Yanam, Mahé, and Caracal. Colonies were also founded in the Indian Ocean, on the Île de Bourbon, Île de France, and the Seychelles. Colonial conflict with Britain. In the middle of the 18th century, a series of colonial conflicts began between France and Britain, which ultimately resulted in the destruction of most of the first French colonial empire and the near-complete expulsion of France from the Americas. These wars were the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the War of the American Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. It may even be seen further back in time to the first of the French and Indian Wars. This cyclic conflict is known as the Second Hundred Years' War. Although the War of the Austrian Succession was indecisive, despite French successes in India under the French Governor-General Joseph-François Dupleix in Europe under Marshal Saxe, the 7 Years' War, after early French successes in Minorca and North America, saw a French defeat, with the numerically superior British conquering not only New France, but also most of France's West Indian colonies, and all of the French Indian outposts, while the peace treaty saw France's Indian outposts, and the Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe restored to France. The competition for influence in India had been won by the British, and North America was entirely lost. Most of New France was taken by Britain. Also ceded to the British were Grenada and St. Lucia in the West Indies, although the loss of Canada would cause much regret in future generations. It excited little unhappiness at the time. Colonialism was widely regarded as both unimportant to France and immoral. Some recovery of the French colonial empire was made during the French intervention in the American Revolution, with St. Lucia being returned to France by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but not nearly as much as had been hoped for at the time of French intervention. True disaster came to what remained of France's colonial empire in 1791, when Saint-Domingue, France's richest and most important colony, was riven by a massive slave revolt, caused partly by the divisions among the island's elite, which had resulted from the French Revolution of 1789. The slaves, led eventually by Toussaint Louverture and then, following his capture by the French in 1801, by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, held their own against French, Spanish, and British opponents, and ultimately achieved independence as Empire of Haiti in 1804. In the meanwhile, the newly resumed war with Britain by the French resulted in the British capture of practically all remaining French colonies. These were restored at the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, but when war resumed in 1803, the British soon recaptured them. France's repurchase of Louisiana in 1800 came to nothing, as the success of the Haitian Revolution convinced Napoleon that holding Louisiana would not be worth the cost, leading to its sale to the United States in 1803. The French attempt to establish a colony in Egypt in 1798 to 1801 was not successful.